We are very, very lucky here in CGPS to have a fantastic resource internally, and that is our research and strategy team. So I'm very excited to introduce Elena Cellini, who's going to present some of her fantastic work. She spends a lot of time keeping an eye on the market and analyzing trends and looking at all kinds of information and digging through the weeds for us to help us make some very insightful decisions. So I will hand this over to Elena to talk about macro trends, labor market insights.
Excellent. So as Michelle mentioned, my name is Elena Cellini. I realize now my name is not on the presentation. After I saw everyone else's, I thought, hey, that would have been a great idea to put my name up there. It's really hard to spell, so I'll send stuff out later for information. So macro trends is an assessment that the team that I'm part of, research and strategy, completes about 3 times a year. Each assessment takes a deep dive into one of 3 areas: US policy, higher education trends, and then labor market supply and demand. So this time we'll be talking about labor market supply and demand. In the keynote, Dean Wilson mentioned risk aversion and CGPS's appetite for risk. As an analyst, gonna be giving you guys some inside info here, we are not comfortable with risk at all. We like to have informed decisions if and when we can. This assessment and the majority of the assessments that we do are in an effort to, again, mitigate that risk, to understand what operating environment we're entering into, what the landscape looks like, to gather as much information as possible so that when we're making decisions that, as an analyst, I may consider to be risky, we understand all of the factors that are entering into that. So again, over this presentation, it is going to be relatively high level because we're talking about the whole labor market. We're not just talking about our relevant labor markets because there are impacts that happen from the entire US economy. So just to briefly discuss the agenda for the next 29 minutes that I have. First, I'm going to briefly provide a status update on the findings we identified during the previous macro trends assessment. I know that some of you were there for that and some of you were not, so we'll sort of talk about some of the sample findings that we've picked out and then talk about what's happening now, so what the status of those are. Then we'll talk about labor market supply and demand, which is really the bulk of this assessment. And finally, I'll discuss the next steps that we've identified as a result of the assessment. In addition, I just want to note that because I only have 30 minutes, there's a lot of information in the appendix. It looks like there's a lot of slides. Because I talk fast, I'm going to go through some of them, but there is a lot more information in here that we looked at, and so I urge you when this is sent out to look at the entire deck because all of this information is important. I really pulled out the stuff that surfaced to the top in terms of directly relevant to CGPS, but again, urge you to take a look in the appendix to see if there's things in there that interest you. So the majority of proposed policy changes that we talked about in the previous assessment are left pending. This is due to a lack of sufficient political support for the reauthorization of higher education. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. Right now, I'm first going to talk about Department of Ed budget because that's something that actually has happened and is not pending. As you can see, the majority of the things on this table are in fact pending. So the first thing I want to talk about is the misalignment of the White House budget proposals and actual spending legislation. So the most recent spending budget approved was $71 billion, which one is the largest ever appropriation from Congress for the Department of Education, largest ever, and the second consecutive increase in funding for the Education Department. And this is all despite the Trump administration proposed budgets and narratives around education funding. So we all see those articles that talk about education funding and changes to funding and smaller budgets, when actually what's happening in Congress is the funding is increasing. So again, there's a disconnect between what's being talked about and what's being passed. So making sure that we're aware of that disconnect and making sure that we're taking data to make decisions rather than taking things that are said either anecdotally or things that are said sort of off the cuff and really looking at what's actually happening, which is the actual spending budget. So the rest of these selected findings we identified are all written into the PROSPER Act. So the PROSPER Act is considered to be an extremely ambitious piece of legislation to reauthorize the Higher Education Act. And the Higher Education Act is arguably the most important piece of policy in higher education. The changes are aimed at student aid spending and includes provisions eliminating graduate students from many of the existing aid programs. So that's really important, right? The majority of our students are graduate students, and we know that a lot of them, about 75%, are using some form of aid. So that, understanding that is really, really important for the future of CGPS. It's also important to note that despite opportunities to do so, Congress has failed to reauthorize the Higher Education Act in both 2016 and 2017. And now we're nearing the end of 2018, and it's very unlikely that this act will be passed through before next year. But the urgency to reauthorize the Higher Education Act is there because this piece of legislation is really old. And it's looking at an environment like Dean Wilson talked about in her keynote that is rapidly, rapidly changing. So again, we have legislation governing an industry that is changing really quickly. So just for an update on the bill itself, it was voted out of committee in December 2017. It has not yet been scheduled to discuss on the House floor or to be voted on by the full House. Thus, the rest of these findings are left pending. So federal aid program consolidation, pending. Opening accreditation pathways, pending, and elimination of program integrity policies. They're all on hold. The one finding, this is the final finding here, that we may see some movement on is emphasis on improved student data collection practices and reporting. So this is included in both the PROSPER Act and the College Transparency Act. These policies are both written to provide more useful data to consumers. When I say consumers, I often mean students. And it's written into different pieces of legislation, which allows it more opportunity to potentially move forward. So again, like I mentioned, the PROSPER Act is a really ambitious piece of legislation that does not at the moment have the political support necessary to really go anywhere as it's written. You can read a lot on projections on what people think or where they think things are going, but as written, again, it is incredibly ambitious, makes a lot of changes. So this piece of data written into a different act is really useful to know because at the moment, the data that we can see about students and about institutions aren't really helpful for determining return on investment. They're helpful for, how many students graduated with X degree, which doesn't really tell you anything about the value of that institution. So now that we've given you the status update, the first thing we're going to talk about is supply considerations. So when I say supply considerations, I'm referring to supply of eligible humans for the labor market. So this is the supply of people that may be entering or moving around in the labor market. So the first thing we're going to talk about, and I've already said it once, and you'll probably hear me say it again, and if you ever have a conversation with me here today or in the future, I will probably talk about return on investment or ROI. So we found that the monetary value of post-secondary education has remained strong. That's great. That's what we want to see. The unemployment rate, which is this graph that you'll see on the left, is 2% for graduates of a master's degree and a professional degree. Additionally, the median weekly earning, so that's that graph on the right, is continuing to increase. And in the US, the average increase in lifetime earnings for an additional year of education is between 7 and 10%. And you can see in this analysis point, in 2011, the last time that this research was done, median weekly earnings for a master's degree was $1,263. What we can see here now, it's up to 1,401. And for professional degrees, it was 1,665. And as you can see here, it's 1,836. So not only is the ROI story there for post-secondary education, but it's also increasing its value. Before I continue, I want to talk a little bit about the modality of this presentation. It may look a little bit like PowerPoint, but it is not PowerPoint. What we worked in to visualize this data is Tableau. So over the next few slides, we're going to look at how different filters and different parameters may impact data. That's something that analysts look at all the time. If we put filters on something or if we make adjustments, how does that change the trend that we're looking at? All of this information in the presentation is also sourced. If you're curious about where a data point comes from, there's a lot of numbers and percentages. I take sourcing very seriously. And again, as an analyst, we're risk averse and we take sourcing very seriously. So any number that you see in here comes from somewhere else. I'm not just saying these things. So for example, I can look at a singular data point, such as, for example, let's look at post-bac enrollment in public schools in 2016. So if I scroll over, you can see that this comes from the National Center for Education Statistics, and I can see the actual value. So what I want is to look at a data point individually, but I also want to look at the data compared to other relevant pieces of information. So this line looks at enrollment in public institutions, but I also want to see, well, how does that trend year over year, and how is that compared to, say, private for-profit institutions or private nonprofit institutions? So when you look at a data point compared to a bunch of other data points, sometimes we see those things in a table and they don't really mean anything. And sometimes we see them in a visualization and they mean a lot. What this means is that enrollment in post-secondary education is stagnating. It is leveling out. So you can see the first piece of data here is from 2010. So over the past 6 years, the compounded annual growth rate is 0.2%. That is a very small number. That is less than 1%. So it's really important to pay attention to, again, singular data points and what those numbers mean, but also to look at those data points in relation to the rest of the industry. One reason that enrollment may be stagnating is the amount of debt and the number of students in debt across graduate education programs. So Michelle mentioned this briefly during her introduction for the keynote. She talked about the state of graduate education and debt. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail and look at it from a few different lenses. So as you can see, graduate students are incurring more debt year over year. Unfortunately, the most recent data that we have at the moment is from 2012. And the reason is because this is looking at cumulative debt. This is not looking at just federal debt. So the difference in those things is federal debt is something that the federal government has access to because they're the ones providing that aid. Cumulative debt is taking into consideration things like private loans, things like grants, that someone would have to report in order for anybody to know that they had that kind of debt. So this takes a lot longer to collect because it's, again, a cumulative number and it's not looking at just one aid source. So as you can see here, at both the master's and the doctoral and professional level, students are incurring more debt year over year. So if we look here at the doctoral number, I find the most staggering number being that this 11% of students in 2003 and 2004 that reported having $120,000 or more in debt has now increased to 54%. So more than half of students graduating from a doctoral or professional degree are incurring more than $120,000 in debt. And then also at the master's level, the darker the numbers are, the more debt that they're incurring. So you can see here in 2003, 2004, we had about 58% were looking at less than $40,000 in debt. That number has decreased to 29 to make space for some of those larger numbers, so 40 and above. So not only are those who are borrowing money borrowing more money, but there are simply more students in terms of student counts borrowing as well. Now, you may say, Elena, there are more graduate students than there were in 1985. And yes, you would be correct. In fact, 155% more graduate students than there were in 1985, where this data starts. However, I would reply and tell you that though there are more graduate students studying, they're also getting debt and need aid at a faster rate than the student growth rate. So what you would want to see is the growth rate increasing at the same rate of student counts. That rate should be the same. When students borrowing has increased 167%, again, compared to that 155% of student count. So yes, there are more students, but there are also more students in need of aid to pay for their education. So now that we know that there are more students borrowing, and they're borrowing larger amounts, we can also see that a large majority of that growth is coming from federal loans. So on this graph, anything that is not orange is a non-federal loan. Anything orange is a federal loan. So this is why when I say the Higher Education Act is really important, this big orange line is the reason why. Because the federal government is funding a lot of this graduate education. So when I say that graduate aid programs are potentially on the chopping block from this policy, this is the reason why, right? So you can see the trends of these blue lines. There is increases happening, but not nearly as the extent as the federal loan rate. We see these increases, and it's really kind of shocking when you look at them next to each other. So yes, institutional grants, there is some increase there, but not nearly to the effect of total federal loans. So again, when we talk about the need to understand policy and the need to pay attention to policy, it's because policy is driving these numbers, and it's driving this potential to cut graduate students out of this debt because this debt is such a large number. So when we look at conferment rates across CGPS's field of study, unsurprisingly, we see that the fastest growth is across health professions. So this looks at both doctoral level and master's level, health fields of study. So I'm grouping here because it would be a lot of lines to look specifically at every conferment field of study type. Additionally, there is a little bit of growth happening in social services, which is where the MSW would sit. We do see growth there, certainly not to the extent of health, but definitely growth. However, we see decreases is when we include the education program, especially at the master's level. So you can see here that top line, though the most degrees are being conferred in that area, that number is decreasing quite a bit. And overall, degree conferment growth is slowing. So we talked about enrollment. We talked about enrollment growth being that 0.2%. So it would make sense that conferment is also decreasing and slowing because in order to confer, you have to enroll. The total number of master's degrees conferred increased 56% between 2001 and 2002, and 2014 and 2015. And now it's projected to increase 22% between 2014-15 and 2026-27. So yes, it is expected to grow in that decade, however, at a much, much slower rate. So yes, there is growth, but it's stagnating, right? That's something to be aware of. And this is why, when we talk in the keynote about diversifying our product types, when we talk about not only diversifying our content, but also diversifying the types of credentials, is because this is the market that we're operating within. So now that we've discussed labor market supply, so those coming into the labor market with similar credentials to our students, we will look at labor market demand and how that's changing. Here we can see over the past 12 months, the unemployment rate has continued to decrease. And from a demand standpoint, decreasing unemployment signals increasing labor demand, which is great. Another piece of this assessment that we want to look at is active CGPS students, as they would be categorized by the Bureau of Labor Statistics Occupational Handbook. So this handbook is a publication that includes information about employee training, education, earnings, job outlook for all occupations categorized across the United States. We looked through reported job titles, and big thanks to Megan for helping with this because this was a long process. For any of you who have ever dealt with self-reported data, it can be kind of difficult to then code that into other areas. I see some folks smiling, so you understand where I'm coming from. So we looked at their reported job titles and their reported employers to try to see where they best fit into the Bureau of Labor Statistics, again, occupational areas. With some more time, we could play around and look at programs compared to each other, but we'll look at some findings here really quickly. Some of the data that we see is unsurprising. So right now, I have our MSW program selected. Without really a big shock, the majority of our MSW students are working as social workers. You know, we could have hypothesized that, and this data point would validate that. If we look at our health informatics program, we see that the majority of our health informatics students are currently working in healthcare. So there's some things that we see when we look at data that is just validating some of these hypotheses or claims that we may have. However, something interesting that we found when looking, and my title gives it away, is that 19% of CGPS students are categorized under the education administrator's occupation area. And actually, it works out perfectly that my presentation comes after this idea of interprofessional, interdisciplinary coursework, because look at this percentage of students that we have working in similar occupations. And these students sit in all of our programs. It's not all education, because this is across programs we have education administrators. So this is something to consider when we consider, you know, Richard asked, what's next? You know, what is the next content area? This is an opportunity to look at the marriage of our existing students and where they're working, where they're hoping to go, and what kind of content they may need for those positions. We also look at this data because it's important to know whether these occupation areas are anticipated to grow faster than average. Right now, the average projected growth rate for all occupations is about 7%. So you can see here, if the bar is orange, the projection is more than average, so greater than 7%. If it is blue, it is projected less than average. So this middle bar is those projections, those growth projections. And so understanding who is going to be coming through the labor market. So these projections can help us understand, is that market size that we're targeting for our audience shrinking, or is it growing? Better understanding of where we may be prioritizing when we talk about product development. When we're strategizing what credentials to be offering, thinking about, well, is that market size going to be much smaller? Does that make sense for us as an institution? Another tool our team uses is Burning Glass, which is a labor market analytics solution that not only looks at that BLS data that we were just talking about, but also job postings for relevant occupations. So when we look at our general occupation areas, so again, education, community and social services, health practitioners, and technical, again, these are a little bit more general just because of we want to talk about everybody, we don't want to leave anybody out. There are a lot of similarities when it comes to these soft skills or baseline skills. So communication, teamwork, planning surface to the top when we look at, again, those soft skills. However, when we look at specialized skills or these more technical skills, there are much less similarities. So again, similar to what was mentioned in the last presentation, there are places where there is a lot of opportunity for interdisciplinary learning, but there are some places that in 8 weeks you simply can't cover off on all of these areas. So again, understanding those pockets where we have that opportunity and understanding where we may be stretching ourselves too thin, trying to fit too many content areas or too many disciplines into our product development or into course development. So really thinking about what skills somebody would need to enter into these occupations, whether or not they align with each other. Additionally, we also always look for and see growth in job postings across CGPS occupation areas, as well as projected growth in those occupation areas from 2016 to 2026. Just to note, that little dip is to be expected. This is only through October 2018, so there are 2 more months of hiring and job posting data that could be collected for this year. But we were just curious to see how this has changed since 2010. Again, sort of unsurprising that healthcare is seeing the most growth. We see here education and training and library with a little bit of growth, and community and social services pretty stagnant. So again, thinking about this when we talk about product development, when we talk about growth, what areas are growing and where do we have those opportunities? So now with the little time I have left, I want to note that there's a lot of additional data in the appendix. I think I said that at the beginning, but we're almost at the end and there's a lot more slides of really interesting information left. However, the most interesting part of the work that my team does is what we're going to look at next, which is when the data culminates into a recommended next steps as a result of the research. So research and data is sort of useless unless it comes to some sort of finding or comes to some sort of movement and growth. Given that this assessment is focused on high-level data, labor market supply and demand, there are less tactics coming out of this as there may have been when we look at higher ed trends or policy trends, for example. A lot of those things are very granular and you can really recommend some really direct things there. It's more intended as a pulse check to have some awareness of the labor market we're operating within. As I mentioned at the beginning, we talked about risk and we talked about our appetite for risk and analysts having a very small appetite for risk. And so understanding and being aware and informed of these things before we make decisions, when we talk about things like a 10-year strategy, these are really important considerations because think of everything that has changed in the last decade. To think as far out as we can, to look at projections, to try to understand how we can fit into that market because it is changing really rapidly. And it's changing in ways that we don't necessarily know about yet. So understanding as much as we can at this moment before we move forward. So that said, first off, we should continue consideration and development of new product types and modalities to align with federal funding policy. Again, I talked about graduate education potentially being at risk for federal funding. Skills requirements. So again, we looked at baseline skills and we looked at that commonality between our fields of study and soft skills or baseline skills. However, looking at skills requirements in the technical and specialized area to understand where those differences exist and where those similarities exist and where maybe, again, interdisciplinary study may not be the best option because of those skills requirements. And then finally, field of study growth trends. So we did see education stagnating. So thinking about that and knowing that when we talk about product development. When we look at education, we're looking at a really big market. So let's look at it in a more granular way and understand, are there pockets of education that are growing? Trend lines do not necessarily mean there's no opportunities and we should all panic and board up the program. That's not what that means at all. It means that we need to think about strategies to either circumvent what we're seeing or to just deal with the operating landscape that we're in. Additionally, it will be important to continue to monitor and track policy shifts, specifically as they relate to the PROSPER Act that could impact CGPS. So again, the Higher Education Act is the most important piece of legislation in higher education. So when that act, whether PROSPER Act or PROSPER 2 or PROSPER 3 is authorized, understanding what that means for our institution and understanding that it could change the way we're reporting our data. It could change the way that we talk about credit hours. It could change the way that for-profit institutions are competitive in this market. It has a lot of potential impact, so understanding those things and being able to work around them is going to be really important. And finally, with the continued saturation of higher ed and new policy requirements, aggregation and sharing of student and graduate outcome data to meet ROI needs will be increasingly important. However, we should keep in mind industry-wide concerns with data collection, use, and privacy, and opportunities to use this data internally to improve operational efficiencies. I'm sure none of you attended this thinking you could get out of here without me talking about the importance of data and data integrity and use of data for marketing, for operational efficiencies, for everything. But here I am talking about it. So when we talk about using data and collecting data, developing a strategy there, right? So our team administers and owns the satisfaction surveys, thinking about the value of every question as that relates to growth. Does it have a strategic objective in the survey, or is it in the survey because we're curious? Thinking really critically about the kind of data we're asking our students to supply so that we are not either fatiguing them or making them uncomfortable in any way, because that's a really big concern at this point. So again, when we talk about the entire labor market, when we talk about the entire industry, thinking about those things that are happening really outside of higher education, but do have an impact on higher education. And then of course, using this data to improve operational efficiencies. So this is something that every organization within UNE, outside of UNE, needs to consider, because we do have access to better data. We do have access to people that know how to look at that data and make recommendations off that data. And rather than spending our time spinning our wheels when we're decision making or wasting time, we talked about Martha coming in and hand putting data into a database, avoiding things like that when we have systems and processes that can be automated rather than take all that time. And I think that's time. If you have questions, feel free to reach out, or you could ask me right now. I think I have 1 minute. No questions? I know it's a lot of information. Nan, do you have a question? Oh, come on. I'll answer really fast.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask, when you show that graph of, you see that the demand for master's and doctorate degree being leveled out. How do we think about that in the context of what Martha was talking about? There's more demand for certificate and non-degree programs. Is there data that suggests that the demand for those are increasing?
That's a really great question. Not in the sources that we currently use. There's not that kind of data. However, using other pieces of information as proxy, looking at our own existing programs and try to understand what data we do have access to potentially project things. Just because NCES doesn't have a data point doesn't mean that product's not a good idea. Our team looks at a whole bunch of indicators when we talk about new products, and looking at something like conferment growth and conferment projections as 1 or 2 indicators out of 20 indicators, and looking at the amount of risk we're taking on if we say, okay, we don't have information on how many people graduated with this degree, but we have these other 17 data points that indicate that this is a good idea. So refining that process a little more, it's definitely, this change in higher education means a really big change for our team as well, and looking at alternative data sources that are potentially a little more challenging to understand and may require some real methodology behind before, rather than just saying, oh, yep, we see 17% growth, so this looks like a good opportunity for us, which we've been able to do in the past. Yes?
So one of the things that I would say, because I think that Nan's question is a very good question, I think there are many ways for us to gather information about potential products. And I'm thinking back to the last webinar that we had in social work that had over 400 or 500 individuals who signed up for it. This was a webinar for individuals who are already out of practice. So I think if we can find a way to utilize this kind of information, that kind of information, as well as the other sources, I think we can find at least some best guess on that.
Absolutely. And including those questions, and when we do have an audience of that size, how can we include a single question that may help us test the idea of a product? So, Agata and I have completed a few consumer insights surveys over the past few months, identifying if there's opportunities to add questions in that may not be directly relevant to the product in mind, but maybe looking further out and thinking about opportunities to leverage that information. When we have the audience, when we have someone answering a question for us, maybe asking it in a way that can serve multiple purposes. Okay, thank you all.